Welcome, dear readers, to Books with a View, a YouTube channel where I talk about books as you look at nice views. Today we'll be discussing Graham Greene's The Comedians, about a group of people who make port in Haiti. To go with the nautical theme, I went to Marina del Rey in Los Angeles and filmed a sunset. You might be asking yourself, are there going to be sea lions in this video? To which I'd respond, weird question, but yeah, there's going to be some sea lions. Look out for them. Now, down to the book at hand. The Comedians refers to the passengers on board a vessel sailing to Haiti at the beginning of the story. All of them have extremely boring names that sound made up, as if they are aliases. The names of the passengers are Mr. Brown, Mr. Jones, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Not as exciting as Brad and Angelina. They're an old couple who want the world to be vegetarians, but more on them later. Mr. Brown is our protagonist who owns a hotel in Port-au-Prince, called the Hotel Trianon. In past years, the hotel's business was pretty good to thriving, but in 1966, under Papa Doc Duvalier's regime of terror, the hotel trade is non-existent. Mr. Brown's coming back to Haiti after running a fool's errand trying to sell it, and he meets his fellow passengers, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who will eventually be his only hotel guests for the entirety of the novel. They're a kind, older couple who have come to Haiti to push the vegetarian agenda and potentially build a vegetarian center. Mr. Brown takes a liking to them and escorts Mr. Smith around town, most of the time introducing him as the presidential candidate, due to the fact that Mr. Smith ran for president once on the vegetarian ticket. Brown usually leaves out the fact that most of the general public did not see the vegetarian ticket on the ballot. Mr. Jones, the last important passenger aboard the ship, is much different than Mr. Smith. Brown doesn't immediately dislike Jones, but he does recognize the fact that Jones is untrustworthy. While Brown can't immediately prove that what Jones says are falsehoods, he gets a gut feeling that the man is a likable liar. This is proven when, later in the novel, Jones tries to pull a scam on Papa Doc Duvalier involving munitions, and, for a few days, is linked to Captain Concasseur, the biggest villain in the novel. Concasseur is a member of the secret police who terrorizes the locality and often faces off with Brown. Every time Concasseur is present, the tension in the scene is palpable, leading to some of the more memorable and exciting moments in the novel. When the boat docks in Port-au-Prince, we meet the local gossip columnist Petit Pierre, who is a genuine pleasure of a character. Everyone knows he survives by feeding the information to the government, so no one really gives him any important details. But he's proven himself a valuable asset to Brown in the past, as well as being an entertaining presence. It's at this point in the novel that the reader meets Martha Pineda, an ambassador's wife and longtime lover of Brown's. I surmise that she's also the biggest reason he's come back to Haiti, given the fact that there's not much left for him except a ruin of a hotel that's likely to be taken over by the government at any moment. Martha and Brown's normal rendezvous spot is a parked car underneath a statue of Columbus. I'm not sure exactly what the symbolism is there. Perhaps because they're exploring dangerous territory, or maybe Columbus is a white invader on Haiti's shores, just like Martha and Brown. A little background info. Columbus landed on Haiti in December of 1492 and built the settlement La Navidad from the timbers of his wrecked ship Santa Maria. When Columbus returned in 1493, however, he discovered that the settlement had been destroyed, and all 39 settlers killed. Perhaps Greene is hinting that Martha and Brown's relationship is always teetering on extinction. Also, don't worry about Columbus's settlement being destroyed. Columbus was a complete psycho who ruled Hispaniola like a warlord from Game of Thrones, often handing out harsh sentences of torture, dismemberment, and public humiliation for minor offenses like not keeping his pantry fully stocked or gossiping behind his back. So yeah, just be sure not to celebrate him when his day comes around this year. Back to the Comedians. I found myself being struck by Greene's prose fairly often. The following description of Martha's son Angel is particularly noteworthy. He was too fat for his age. He had his father's eyes like brown buttons. He sucked bonbons. He noticed things. And he made claims all the time on his mother's exclusive attention. He seemed to draw the tenderness out of our relationship as he drew the liquid center from a sweet with a long, sucking breath. In the book, Angel serves as this opposing force to Brown, having an awareness far beyond his age of what their relationship is and the threat it poses. It's kind of left up to the reader to interpret whether or not Ambassador Pineda knows about the affair, but Angel seems to be actively sabotaging Brown's attempts at clandestinely meeting with Martha. It's a pretty hilarious aspect of the book, how much the main character hates this chubby little kid. Mr. and Mrs. Smith are great additions to the novel. I imagine Greene probably put them in the story to give himself a conduit to explain things to the audience. They came to Haiti with no real idea of what to expect. They travel the globe, spreading the good word of vegetarianism. But they also have a strong moral fiber, and throughout the novel, both stand up to injustices, even when, as a reader, you'd rather just have them stay silent. They often refer to a past trip to Nashville where Mrs. Smith stood up to white supremacists who, I'm guessing, were not vegetarians. At mealtimes, they are self-sufficient, having brought a generous amount of odd-sounding foods with them like Yeastrel and Nuttolene, both real brand names by the way. A funny section of the book has them eating on board the boat, and the carnivorous captain admits that he can't stand the sight of their vegetarian food and it makes him nauseous. But most importantly, they rely on Mr. Brown to explain the ways of Haiti to them. Brown explains just how dangerous parts of the city are, and that the local police has been replaced by Duvalier's paramilitary force, the Tonton Macoute, an organization literally named after a Haitian boogeyman who abducts children and stuffs them in a sack until he's ready to eat them for breakfast. Mr. and Mrs. Smith usually react to information with a wise nod of the head, but they never seem to take it as seriously as they should. It's never really spoken, but Brown obviously cares a lot about them since he spends the first half of the book escorting Mr. Smith around the city, serving as translator and sometimes guiding Mr. Smith around dangers as if he were as clueless as Mr. Magoo. But it's true that in Haiti, old Mr. Smith is a babe in the woods. Mr. Smith has an outdated sense of justice and morality that blinds him to the levels of danger in certain situations. Against Mr. Brown's advice, he goes to the post office himself to buy stamps, only to be harassed by a cyclone of beggars. When Smith and Brown meet with various Haitian government officials, it's Brown who helps Smith with the bribing process, which is the only way to get any sort of bureaucratic momentum going. To scope out a good location for the Vegetarian Center, Brown and Smith travel to the government side of a future town called Duvalierville. It's mostly incomplete buildings that are slowly falling into disrepair because the money for construction has been squandered. Mr. Smith, thinking he's helping a beggar, gives the man a handful of bills. The beggar, a man with no feet, looks at the bills in horror because Mr. Smith has just put a target on his back. As Smith and Brown drive away, Brown sees the beggar crawling away from someone who's already trying to rob him. Midway through the novel, Brown has an eye-opening trip to the local brothel. The brothel's owner, Mère Catherine, keeps her composure even when she lives in a time of terror. She stands up to Captain Concasseur in small ways, like giving Brown 7-Up when Concasseur expressly forbids it. The Tonton Macoute scare away her usual clientele, but at the very least she won't stand to see her girls mistreated. She'll let them take away a night's worth of customers, but she'll never let them take away her dignity. I like Greene's inclusion of a character like Mère Catherine, who is a local Haitian who's civilized and has a sense of honor. It's the best way to emphasize the fact that the Haitian people themselves are not to blame for the evil that's risen to power in their homeland. Now's probably a good time to talk about my main issue with the protagonist. Mr. Brown's not very active and doesn't really have any motivation. He's been to New York in an attempt to sell his hotel to a sucker, but with no suckers found, the beginning of the novel finds him on a boat heading toward his doomed hotel. I'm not exactly sure why he's going back to Haiti at all. Brown should probably just cut his losses instead of going back to a dangerous country where he could easily lose his life. Perhaps he's going back to rekindle things with Martha, but he must know that's a long shot. She could potentially leave her husband for Brown, but she would never leave her darling, deplorable son. Once he gets to Haiti, Brown just kind of drifts around with no real goal. If the other passengers on the ship weren't characters in the novel, I assume he'd spend most of the novel moping at his hotel. As it is now, he runs errands with Mr. Smith and has shadowy conversations with the perpetually deceptive Mr. Jones. I like Brown well enough, it's a great perspective for the novel, but for him to be a memorable character, he would need something more. He'd need to want something instead of just taking whatever plot happens to come his way. There's a scene where even Dr. Maggio questions Brown about what he's doing in Haiti. Maggio explains that Brown's mother would have taken a stand against Papa Doc's regime and probably be living in the surrounding mountains by now with her younger lover. Brown wonders why Maggio is still around, to which the doctor replies that even tyrants get sick sometimes, and, in times of illness, it always helps not to have chased out all the competent doctors. It struck me toward the end of the novel that Brown is similar to Humphrey Bogart's character Rick in Casablanca. He owns a leisure spot in a foreign land that is corrupted by a fascistic force. He's in love with a woman who's already with a much nicer guy, and he's reluctant to involve himself in a rebellion against the tyrannical regime. But love wins out, and because of his lady, he ends up helping out the underdog rebels and fighting the bad guys. Unlike Rick, though, the only reason Brown escorts Mr. Jones to the rebel base is because he's jealous that Jones is cooped up in the embassy with Martha all day. He fears that sooner or later she'll cheat on her ambassador husband with Jones instead of with himself, and it's this fear that compels him to get the deceitful major out of the embassy as soon as possible. It's almost beside the point that this will help out the rebels. Jones eventually does have a truthful moment with Brown. At least, I read it as truthful. There's an argument to be made that it's just another parcel in Jones' infinite store of lies, but I'm going to take his confession at face value. Basically, he was in the military, but nowhere near the front lines. He helped organize entertainment for the troops and once met Noel Coward. He of course waits until the last possible moment to tell Brown the truth, so that there's no way to reverse the decision to hand Jones over to the rebels in hopes that he can train them. They have, without a doubt, crossed the Rubicon. And once everything is said and done, Jones gets an honorable end. It's not something I expected. Every sign in the novel seemingly pointed to Jones reaping what he was in the process of sowing, meaning that he'd end up paying for his attempted hoodwink of Papa Doc Duvalier in a humiliating way. But he actually got to spend some of his last days with a rebel force, albeit a poorly supplied one. I suppose he had a version of an embarrassing comeuppance when he had to leave the ship disguised as a woman on Brown's arm, but knowing what we now know of Jones's theatrical past, it probably wasn't his first time leaving a location in a shameful costume. Overall, I thought the novel was incredibly well written. I've read Greene's Brighton Rock before this novel, and I certainly look forward to reading more of his work. There's about a 30-year gap between Brighton Rock and The Comedians, 1938 to 1966, and Greene's grown tremendously as a writer in those years. His story is more compelling, and he seems to understand his characters more. Brighton Rock's Pinky is a far more memorable character than Mr. Brown in The Comedians, though, so maybe there is something to be said about youthful invigoration. Lastly, I know this has been made into a movie already with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, but if it were to be remade today in the year of our Lord 2022, here's who I think they should cast. Ray Fiennes as Mr. Brown, Bérénice Marlowe as Martha Pineda, Henry Ian Cusick as Ambassador Pineda, Jimmy Jean Louis as Captain Concassar, Jonathan Majors as Petit Pierre, Donald Sutherland as Mr. Smith, Lois Smith as Mrs. Smith, and Clark Peters as Dr. Maggio. And that's all I have for you bibliophiles, so thank you for watching. If you liked what you heard, subscribe for more book reviews in the future. Like the video and comment if there are any novels in particular you'd like me to read. And, as always, do not close this book, but read a little before you sleep. There is wisdom here.